In our first one, we talked about general pay data reporting concepts. Our second webinar, we talked about the United States current reporting requirements. And in this webinar, we're going to go deep into the EU Pay Transparency Directive, which is a really robust piece of legislation that came out of the EU that the EU member states are at this point kind of scrambling to try and adopt. Right now, there isn't formal legislation adopted by any of the EU member states in terms of adopting the EU Pay Transparency Directive into their legislation. But Maxfield and I will, attempt to predict to outline kind of the baseline requirements of the EU Pay Transparency Directive that the EU member states are supposed to adopt, and kind of what that timeline is looking like. These slides are going to be, as a warning, these slides are going to be pretty dense. So Max and I will try and simplify them. And, at the very least, at the end of the webinar, you'll have them. So hopefully they'll be a really good resource for you guys when you're trying to review this.
Before we dive in too deeply as well, I wanted to just kind of add a little asterisk here. This presentation is going to be almost exclusively about the EU Pay Transparency Directive. For anybody in the EU right now that is looking at what are the current compliance requirements associated with equal pay or pay equity in the EU, please note that there are a number of member states that have existing requirements that this directive is going to overlay over and or replace at implementation. So this is really kind of a looking forward webinar. We're going to do some more kind of deep dives into maybe current regulatory requirements in some of the EU member states at a later date. And we're also happy if anybody has any questions about specific member states' current rules and regulations, compliance requirements, throw them in the chat. We might not be able to get to them today, but we'll definitely get those answers out to you at a later date.
Awesome. Cool. Let me go forward. A bit of the background. So the EU Pay Transparency Directive was passed in March 30th, 2023. And really it's to underscore the pay equity standard that's prevalent across the EU, and that's the equal pay for equal work or work of equal value. Right? If you come from the United States, this is a different standard than what we're used to. In the United States, we're really used to dealing with the equal pay for equal work, right? This equal value really isn't prevalent in the United States. So we're going to talk more about what that means. And the deadline for the EU member states to adopt the EU Pay Transparency Directive is June 2026. So there's a bit of background in terms of why the EU Pay Transparency Directive was passed, but I think the main point is this 13% pay gap, right? Women on average in the EU are being paid 13% less than men, and this pay gap has remained stagnant for over a decade at this point. And really, the purpose of the EU Pay Transparency Directive is to minimize and shrink this pay gap that's been prevalent and so hard to get rid of for so long. And the goal is, by implementing these pay reporting and pay transparency standards, that this pay gap will shrink as a result. And so, Max, you maybe can talk about some of the baseline requirements for what the EU Pay Transparency requires.
Yeah, so the EU Pay Transparency Directive, and I'm not going to bore everybody by reading every single piece of information on this slide. This is mostly informational, but I do want everybody to kind of get the understanding of how it's broken down, right? And there are three primary categories, if you will, of employer responsibility, right? There are reporting requirements, there are transparency requirements, and then there are transparency standards, right? And so generally speaking, when we're talking about reporting requirements, we're talking about two different things. We're either talking about an actual pay data report that an employer has to produce and have available. And we're also talking about the mechanism that gets put in place if an employer falls below a particular standard, right? So if an employer is unable to justify and correct pay gaps of 5% or more, they're going to have to conduct a joint pay assessment. We'll go into a little bit more detail of what that means a little later on. But those are the two kind of main reporting features, right? And then there's transparency requirements, right? And transparency requirements are a little different than reporting requirements. And if you're a US based person on the call, you're probably actually more familiar with pay transparency measures than you are pay data reporting measures, in part because we have a lot more jurisdictions in the United States with transparency laws than we do have reporting laws on the books. Transparency laws, generally speaking, require employers to make certain data available either to applicants and or to current employees. In the context of this, we're talking about initial pay levels, salary ranges, and then also making criteria for determining pay and pay levels and pay progression easier and more accessible to their workers, right? So in the context of the Transparency Directive, this is both about a pre-employment transparency measures as well as a post-employment transparency measures, right? One thing to note about the transparency requirements is that they apply to a broader range of employers than the pay reporting requirements do, right? We've got the applicability mentioned there. And then we've got the transparency equity standards, right? This is the idea that employers are required to ensure the principles of equal pay are applied across the board to their employee workforce. And this applies to every employer. So this is just the basic standard, right, that is applicable to any employer, even if they don't actually have a reporting requirement or a transparency requirement. So as far as implementation, right? So as I mentioned in my slide before, this is probably the only time we're going to go into this, is that there are currently 14 EU member states that do have existing pay equity reporting requirements, and they vary wildly between these different jurisdictions exactly how they've been implemented and what they're requiring employers to do, who they apply to, and the relative compliance burden associated with each one. There are 13 member states that currently don't have requirements. And so one of the things that Nasser and I have been kind of talking about, we talked about it a lot in one of our previous presentations, is it's still a little unclear how, especially with member states that have existing requirements, how the new Pay Transparency Directive is going to get layered into their law, right? Is it going to get layered on top of the existing laws, requirements, i.e. just kind of doubling up on requirements? Is it going to replace requirements? It's going to be a lot easier, I think, for the countries that don't have any existing reporting requirements to go through the adoption process because they can simply follow the directive. We did get one country with current reporting requirements that has actually proposed their first step of implementing the EU Pay Transparency Directive, and that's Sweden. And Nasser and I talked a lot because we did a separate presentation on Sweden that I think is available for you guys to download. And it's kind of the first step that we've seen towards implementation, and we found that it was kind of a layered approach, that Sweden did keep certain aspects of their existing pay reporting requirements while layering the directive on top of it. So just to give you guys, as we're kind of embarking on this hour-long EU Pay Transparency Directive, an idea of some of the key terminology of what we're talking about here. Again, I'm not going to read all of these definitions in detail, but I do want to pause for a minute and make sure we all understand that, like, what does pay mean in the context of this directive, right? It's the ordinary wages and any other consideration, whether cash or in kind, which a worker receives directly or indirectly, right? So it's a really broad definition of pay that is applicable to this directive when you're thinking about your employees, right? Pay level is looking at the gross annual pay and the corresponding gross hourly pay of individual employees. And again, pay here goes back to that initial definition of pay. The gender pay gap, and let's be, just to be clear, and again, this is mostly for our viewers that might be here in the United States, the EU directive is primarily meant to address the gender pay gap. right? In the United States, we have a lot of our pay equity laws are a lot broader as far as applicability of different classes, whether it be race, gender, ethnicity, religion, national origin, and such. But the EU Pay Transparency Directive is really directed towards gender, right? So the gender pay gap means the difference in average pay levels between female and male workers of an employer expressed as a percentage, right, of the average pay level. So you'll see us or hear us talking a lot in percentages when we're talking about the gender pay gap. Categories of workers. So categories of workers, generally speaking, is talking about workers performing the same work or work of equal value. And I'm not going to, we have other slides later on that are going to really get into the details of work of equal value. So I'm going to leave diving into that until later in the presentation. But generally speaking, work of equal value means work that is determined to be of equal value in accordance with non-discriminatory, objective, gender-neutral criteria. Right? So we'll chew on that in a few slides regarding what exactly that means. Direct discrimination means a situation when one person is treated less favorably on the grounds of sex than another person, right? Direct. Indirect is a situation in which an apparently neutral provision, criteria, practice would end up putting the person of one sex at a particular disadvantage when compared to the person of the other sex, right? So really, this directive is meant to address both types.
And thanks for getting through this. And just talking about that slide, a lot of these definitions too are, I think, intentionally, potentially vague from the EU Pay Transparency Directive, because it's going to be up to the EU member states also to expand upon some of those definitions. For example, pay is really open-ended, and a lot of people are kind of wondering what goes into pay, and we'll talk about that more. But yeah, it's a lot of definition to get through. It's pretty technical, but hopefully it'll make a little bit more sense as we go through. One of the first things that we want to talk about is the most immediate action item for employers to take care of. What are the reporting requirements for the EU Pay Transparency Directive, right? What are employers now required to put together and output either through a regulatory body or publish on their website? So we're going to go dive into that. So there are two big buckets in terms of the reporting requirement for the EU Pay Transparency Directive, right? One is the just general pay data reporting requirements. And so ultimately, employers with at least 100 workers or employees will be required to disclose this pay gap information. And we'll talk about more exactly what the criteria for this pay data report are, but generally they're raw pay gap statistics comparing men and women across the different mean and median pay gap metrics. And so we'll talk about that. And those metrics will eventually have to be published on a website or be publicly accessible, and then also be reported potentially to the governing body for that EU member state. Now, the secondary reporting is something called the joint pay assessment. Now, this is a requirement that only gets triggered if employers have a 5% pay gap in a worker category and they're unable to justify through objective, gender-neutral criteria on why that pay gap exists. Essentially, if this joint pay assessment gets triggered, you're going to have to be working with the entity for that EU member state to rectify these gender pay gaps and also dig deeper on why these pay gaps exist at your company, right? So bucket number one eventually going to apply to every employer with over 100, and bucket number two, something gets triggered in the event that there's a pay gap at your organization that is too large under the EU Pay Transparency Directive.
Yeah, and I just wanted to add in here for anybody that might not be catching on to some of what Nasser is speaking to there as far as the raw pay gap versus what's going on in a joint pay assessment, right? So just to reiterate, the raw pay gap really is just the straightforward pay gap, right? Measuring men and women and making no adjustments for legitimate non-discriminatory factors, right? Things like experience, education, right? All of these things that could actually explain why in a particular situation, a man is being paid more than a woman, or a woman is being paid more than a man, right? And so when you're looking at this joint pay assessment obligation, that's what we're getting at with the idea of, right, that can't be explained, right? So if you have a raw pay gap of 5 or more percent, you then have to essentially do an analysis factoring in your legitimate wage influencing factors into your analysis, and running that again and seeing whether or not you can justify that pay gap of over 5%, right? And that's something that, we at Trusaic, that's essentially our bread and butter of what we do, is doing these kind of analyses, including your wage influencing factors and adjusting for your different pay analysis groups, and getting to an idea of what is your adjusted pay gap versus just your raw pay gap.
Thanks, Max. Let me go into sort of the deadlines for the reporting applicability. So the EU Pay Transparency Directive is going to have a phased rollout where larger employers are going to have to comply with an earlier deadline, right? So employers with over 250 workers will have to do the gender pay gaps annually, and the first reports will be due in June of 2027. Employers with 150 to 249 workers will have that same deadline, but their cadence is going to be less frequent, right? They're going to have to report every 3 years. And then ultimately, employers with 100 or more workers are going to also have to report, but in June of 2031 would be the first theoretical deadline, and their cadence is also less frequent. So in terms of what, this is a component that kind of freaks out HR departments, right? Is what type of data do we have to keep track of for the EU Pay Transparency Directive, right? Because it is potentially asking for pay data that HR departments are just not typically used to collecting, right? So if we talk about the compensation elements, we have pay, base pay, complementary or variable components of pay, right? Or some 3 definitions. And what I really want to draw your attention to is the complementary or variable components of pay. And just talk about it, any benefits in addition to the ordinary basic or minimum wage salary, which the worker receives directly or indirectly, whether in cash or in kind. And it has some of these examples. And really, this definition caused a lot of heartache because it's not clearly defined what should ultimately be included in this complementary or variable component of pay. And it's going to be up to also the EU member states to maybe more clearly provide guidance, right? Does healthcare, do we have to quantify healthcare insurance? Does a company car count? All these, other provisions that could be, rolled into an employee's pay. One thing also that Max, you'll touch on is on the groupings. What are the categories of workers, right? So companies are going to have to potentially do an evaluation of which workers perform the work of equal value. Now, this question is difficult because, in the United States, for example, the comparison is easy. It's equal pay for equal work, a doctor to a doctor or something like that. But this potentially requires comparisons between jobs that are not necessarily super similar, right? So does an engineer at your company have the same value as an account executive or a sales manager, right? And these are very different types of positions, for example, but they might have the same value to your company. So the company ultimately is going to have to assign value to different positions in order for it to properly come up with job categorizations per the EU Pay Transparency Directive. And talking more about this, yeah, this is going back to the worker categorization. Maybe Max, you want to chime in here on something that also gives people away about
well,
the
and this is where I think one of the interesting things about implementation of this across the EU member states is going to come out is in this concept of worker categorization, because there are, for example, in member states that have existing pay equity reporting programs, the way they currently categorize workers, and I think we use France as an example on this slide, right? They might choose to keep those categorizations the same, right? Because again, the directive's only guidance on this, right, is that they grouped in a non-arbitrary manner based upon non-discriminatory and objective gender-neutral criteria, right? And that, in generally speaking, that they should cooperate with workers' representatives in accordance with national law and/or practice, right? And so this means that this is one of those areas where I think we are going to get, or potentially get, again, it hasn't been implemented yet, so I could be wrong. But this is where I have a feeling that we're going to get some wide variation in how this is implemented across the EU, because the idea of work for equal value could end up being different in France than it is in Germany, than it is in Spain, than it is in Italy, than it is in Sweden, so on and so forth. This, I think, is going to create some real headaches for employers that work across the EU and have employee bases in a variety of different EU countries, because it might put you in a position where you are doing a completely different worker categorization analysis in each of those different jurisdictions. And it's just going to add to the compliance burden. So, I mean, again, I think our guidance on what this means for employers is, one, you're going to have to be diligent in doing a job evaluation using objective criteria. And then you're going to need to document it too, because this is something that is going to be looked at. And because there is no just set standard, right? At this point in time, and maybe it'll be different. Maybe individual countries will kind of take the bull by the horn here and publish categories that are going to comply with worker categorization within that EU member state and give more direct guidance here. But outside of direct guidance in any individual member state's laws when they implement this, this is going to be just a massive documentation project for every country that needs to implement this.
Yeah, and some EU member states already have pay reporting requirements that requires this sort of job categorization. Spain, for example, right? Employers are supposed to assign values in a similar metric. So, if employers already sort of operate in Spain and already have practice doing this, it could be potentially sort of expanding that framework to other EU member states.
True, and to add on to that, as I mentioned, right, the guidance here is to work with workers' representatives in different jurisdictions. And so if even outside of national law, there's already essentially a collectively bargained set of guidelines regarding job categorization, absent express opposite guidance from that EU member state in implementation, employers will likely still be able to rely on those job categories that they have negotiated with the workers' representatives on in order to comply with this.
And here we're going to be talking about sort of the main reporting piece of the EU Pay Transparency Directive, right? It's these metrics. I think the numbering may have got a little messed up on the transposition here, but realistically, there's 6 sort of public metrics that go out, and there's sort of a 7th that's kind of used for the joint pay assessment as well. And if any of people here do Ireland or UK pay gap reporting, it is similar, and you're going to see kind of a similarity here in terms of what this looks like. It's going to be, one, the mean gender pay gap. It's going to be a raw pay gap analysis, a median gender pay gap, and then mean gender pay gap for complementary or variable components, or supplemental or bonus components, and mean gender pay gap for complementary or variable components, and then proportion of female and male workers receiving complementary or variable components, these bonus pieces, these extra pieces, and then the proportion of female workers in each quartile pay band, right? So if you've ever looked at the UK or Ireland pay gap reporting, it's very similar to that, in which you're going to have to create sort of 4 little quartiles and assign what percentage of men and women take up each of those quartiles and sort of publish those. And then the 7th, kind of the most complex, and it's potentially going to trigger that joint pay assessment, is the gender pay gap between workers by categories of workers broken down by the ordinary basic salary and complementary or variable components, right? And so this is where you're going to have to create those category of workers and do a pay gap analysis between those different categories. So this is sort of that main first bucket of reporting that's going to go out per the EU Pay Transparency Directive. So the EU Pay Transparency Directive requires these metrics to be filed with the relevant regulatory body of that EU member state, but also metrics 1 through 6, the EU Pay Transparency Directive requires that these be publicly accessible, right? So these are going to be potentially published on a website or otherwise be publicly available. And internally, these metrics will also have to be shared. Specifically, that kind of final metric in terms of the job categories, and we'll talk about this later when we talk about transparency, is that workers are going to be able to request from their employers, the compensation ranges in their company for their specific job category.
Yeah, and one thing, if you wouldn't mind actually going back just a second on that slide, Nasser. Yeah. One thing I want to point out here is that this is another area where there could end up being some variation between EU member states on an implementation basis, because the directive itself leaves certain things kind of as suggested but not required, but leaves the opportunity for member states to require more, right? So for example, if it's an EU member state that might actually already be doing more than this from a reporting requirement, I anticipate those EU member states continuing to require that extra level of reporting beyond the directive. For example, the directive, says that EU member states may wish to publish data explaining the gender pay differences or gaps, like those raw gaps they're reporting on. I could see an EU member state actually requiring them to do so, and or requiring them to provide even more detail. So we'll see from a reporting requirements perspective. I think everybody just needs to look at this and understand that this is a base level of the reporting requirements, and that individual EU member states may add on to this.
So joint pay assessment. So this is sort of that second bucket of reporting that gets triggered if there's that 5% pay gap or more in that worker category, right? So the joint pay assessment is a type of audit, and it requires the employer to perform additional pay, report on additional pay metrics and conduct additional analysis. And I think we'll have more slides kind of discussing more of the joint pay assessment here. Again, it's that sort of 5% triggering of a category of workers. And this is important, it's in addition, the employer cannot justify that gap on the basis of objective gender neutral factors. If you sort of tuned in to our webinar 1, we talked about the difference between a raw pay gap analysis and a pay equity analysis. And that's kind of what is relevant here, right? So there might be a 5% raw pay gap in a category of workers, but that raw pay gap doesn't take into account certain wage influencing factors such as seniority, performance, and other things, right? So for example, our pay parity software, we do pay equity analysis. We could potentially account for some of that 5% or 5% or more raw pay gap in terms of a holistic pay equity analysis. So this is what sort of 2 is referring to is, do you have some sort of analysis or documentation that can show that, yeah, you might have a raw pay gap analysis of over 5%, but when you take into account other factors, you're actually underneath the 5%, right? And then finally, the joint pay assessment gets triggered if the employer has not remedied the unjustified difference in average level of pay within 6 months, right? So there's sort of a 6-month window in which an employer can remedy that unexplained difference.
Yeah, and then just to add on and make sure everybody's clear on this, these are all and requirements, right? So it's if you have a pay gap of 5% or greater and you can't justify it and you can't remedy it within that 6-month period, that's what triggers this joint pay assessment.
Exactly. So this is just more of the, for the sake of time, I won't go into every single sort of requirement of the joint pay assessment. I do want to get to some more questions here that they're really good. I see them popping up. But generally speaking, it's going to require the employer to conduct more analysis in terms of why this pay difference is happening within the company, more attention to female workers. For example, one of the requirements is the employer has to analyze the proportion of female and male workers who benefited from any improvement in pay following return from maternity, paternity, parental, or career leave, right? So these are the additional analytical metrics that the employer has to take on. And in addition, the employer has to follow up the relevant regulatory body in relation to the joint pay assessment. So obviously, this is something that employers will seek to avoid altogether, if at all possible. And again, for the sake of time, I'll briefly go over this. Maxfield and I did a more in-depth webinar in terms of how Sweden is the only EU member state currently that's even put forth proposed legislation on how they would adopt the EU Pay Transparency Directive. And what we saw from Sweden is that they already do have some kind of pay reporting requirements in their current legislation. What they essentially did was, raise the bar by now you have to do that, and as well as comply with these EU Pay Transparency Directive metrics as well. And in addition, some of the softer language in the EU Pay Transparency Directive regarding, EU member states may impose sanctions. Sweden did, in the proposed legislation, say, we will sanction you if you don't, provide these pay metrics. And I'll hand it over to Maxwell to talk quickly about some of these transparency requirements in the aptly named EU Pay Transparency Directive.
Yeah, and we'll talk a little bit about how they compare to US-based transparency requirements as well. But as Nasser said, this is going to be focused mostly on what's existing in the EU Pay Transparency Directive. So just as an overview, right, the pay transparency requirements in the directive apply to pre-employment information as well as during employment information. Some requirements are additive, right, and some are subtractive, right? A good example of a subtractive requirement is the ban on employers asking applicants about current or past salary during the job interview. Right? Whereas the additive requirements is an employer's right to request criteria used to determine pay, right? So primarily what we're talking about when we're talking about pre-employment transparency, we're talking about the requirement to disclose initial pay level or its range, either in the job vacancy notice itself or prior to the job interview, right? So it doesn't have to be, at least per the directive, it doesn't have to be in the job notice. It can be provided separately, but it has to be provided prior to the interview. So it can't just be provided at the interview, it has to be provided beforehand. This is another area, though, where we could see a layering and or a shift on each individual EU member state, because remember, these requirements are a minimum band and they could be built upon. So we could see EU member states going, no, it has to be in the job posting. Right, it has to be provided there. It can't just be provided beforehand. So we'll see as EU member states implement this. For those member states that might already have transparency measures that are more stringent than this, I would anticipate they're going to keep them. Right, and then transparency during employment, workers having the right to request individual and average pay level information, categorized by sex for workers performing the same work or work of equal value. And so this is important to kind of hit on right here, right, is the requirements during employment. And remember, and the reason I'm pointing this out is because the transparency requirements apply to a wider range of employers than the pay reporting requirements do. And you can see here that the transparency requirement for your current workers is providing them essentially with the data points, right, that you would almost need to have provided had you done pay data reporting, right? You kind of have to have built a report that categorizes workers for performing the same work or work of equal value categorized by gender. And it's triggering an almost quasi pay data reporting requirement that you don't have to share with anybody until your worker requests it. Right, so the applicability, right, and again, I already touched on this, right, is the pay transparency requirements around salary transparency are going to apply to an employer regardless of size, right? So again, particularly when you're looking at the requirements of how you need to be able to present data to current employers, or employees, I should say, you're going to almost need to do a mini pay equity analysis, right? Because you're going to need to categorize employees, figure out what definitions, what job categories are doing work of equal value within your company. And you're going to have to categorize the pay that's in those groups. And then you're going to have to share it. And so for all of those employers that are thinking, I don't have a reporting requirement, so I don't necessarily need to worry about this, you might end up with a bunch of unhappy workers if they end up being provided with a report that shows that women or men are being wildly underpaid or overpaid in particular job categories.
Yeah, and this is that. Just to go back to that, so that one's one to look out for, because the employee threshold applicability requirements for reporting, it doesn't seem that's for the EU Pay Transparency Directive, that's not necessarily the case for this transparency requirement for the EU Pay Transparency Directive, right? It's essentially saying that employers, regardless of size, are going to have to provide their employees with that relevant range, regardless of the size. So that's a big one to watch out for, even if you're sort of a smaller company that has some sort of presence within the EU. So this goes to what the pay transparency requirement is before employment. And again, this is kind of reflective of a nature of pay transparency we've seen across the globe, specifically within the United States. There's more and more jurisdictions adopting this sort of a pay transparency approach of providing salary, before employment. So, employers have to provide the initial pay or pay range to an employee or employment applicant. It could be in the job posting or prior interview otherwise. I think this goes to one of the questions I saw in the chat, I think by Anvesh, who she asked, does it have to be necessarily the format of a salary range? And my understanding of the EU Pay Transparency Directive is no, it doesn't have to necessarily be a sort of coinciding with the actual posting, but the applicant has to know what that range is prior to that. I think Sweden, for example, in terms of that range, it doesn't say that it has to be accompanied in sort of a website or a posting. So that's a small variation if you're used to some of the laws in the United States that sort of say that the salary range has to be within the actual posting. If there's any vacancy notices, the job titles must be gender neutral and the hiring processes must be led in a non-discriminatory manner. And there's a salary history ban. Again, this is also something that's taking place across the globe, in which employers are prohibited about talking about the employee's previous pay, unless essentially it's used as a bargaining chip by the applicant. So pay transparency during the disclosure. Again, as we were talking about before, the employee has the right to receive the information regarding the pay levels around their job category, right? So that's a big one. And it has to be provided no later than 2 months from the date of the request. Employers have to also inform the workers on the annual basis the right to receive this information as well. And employees can also publish their salary. So there's no prohibition on them talking about their salary. And finally, workers can also request access to objective criteria used to determine the pay ranges and career progression. So, and this slide is sort of talking about what that process is in terms of talking about workers' representatives. So the worker representatives have the right to ask for additional clarification and details regarding these transparency measures and any of the data provided, right? And sort of explanations on why there might be gender pay differences and the systems for putting these workers into categories, right? So it's a lot, as Maxfield was talking about earlier, a lot of documentation in terms of how employers sort of create these categories and what is the rationale for having sort of the pay across pay differences in these job categories. And Maxfield may talk us through some of the, the employment equity standards that are in the EU Pay Transparency Directive and sort of that equal pay for equal work of equal value.
Yeah, we're gonna talk a little bit more about the standard itself, right, and how that works. And in our previous presentations, we've often put these slides first, but we wanted to make sure that we got through all of the different sections of the EU Pay Transparency Directive from a compliance perspective, because before we dug into the standards this time around, just because there's a lot of meat here. So equal pay for equal work, right? This is a very simple standard. It's existed in the EU. It's the US-based standard, right? And it's very straightforward. Workers performing identical work must be paid equitably. I think the example Nasser gave earlier in the presentation is a doctor needs to be paid equitably with another doctor. You have two accountants on the same team. They need to be paid equitably with each other. It's kind of that really straightforward equitable analysis where there's really not much to argue about whether or not these are comparable jobs, right? Because they're doing the same job function. And so that's the easy part of the standard. This is now, as we're saying, is going to be the much more interesting, and there's some really good questions in our Q&A that we'll address about equal pay for work of equal value, right? So the idea behind equal pay for work of equal value really gets to comparing classes of workers, right? And the idea behind it from a law perspective and a policy perspective is that you don't want traditionally gender-based jobs, right? Or jobs that were traditionally dominated by a particular gender to end up being paid inequitably with a job that was dominated by another gender. An example that's often given is things like maintenance people versus housekeepers at, say, for example, a hotel chain, right? Where you might have one that is, from a gender perspective, predominantly male, and another job category that from a gender perspective is predominantly female. So this work of equal value is getting at making sure that you don't have large groups, because maybe you have a handful of female maintenance people and they're being paid equitably compared to the other maintenance people. You have a handful of male housekeepers and they're being paid equitably with the other female housekeepers, but maybe there's a huge imbalance between the two groups that arguably are performing work of equal value for that particular organization, right? So equal value applies even when jobs are performed under different conditions. They might require a different set of qualifications or skills, and they might require different levels of effort. So the policy behind it is, arguably a good one. The challenge here is going to be the implementation of this, because as soon as you open this up in this kind of relatively subjective manner, you're going to create issues for companies that are honestly and legitimately trying to meet this standard.
And hopefully this answers Julia's question, like what was the reason behind this, right? Is it because, yeah, and that really is the reason. Is this standard trying to go above and beyond the equal pay for equal work? Because in the equal pay for equal work, there's already sort of inherent biases on which jobs are around which genders. So this is trying to go one level deeper and deconstructing what certain jobs being male or female dominated.
Yeah, I mean, and it's interesting, and we're not going to, I won't belabor the point here because this isn't a presentation about Canada, but Canada actually focuses just on that and actually forces you to compare the categories to each other and not necessarily the individuals within the category to the other individuals within that grouping, right? And so they're primarily focused on the idea of fixing, from a public policy perspective, about fixing that class difference between different groups of workers that might have been predominantly female versus predominantly male, versus fixing the individual issues within a group of people being paid inequitably within that group. So again, right, valuing work. The biggest thing that we can emphasize on this slide and in the implementation of this for individual employers in the EU is one, pick a methodology. Try to pick one that is either recommended or has been used by either the EU member state that you're in. Some of them are going to have specific methodologies that they like to use, right, for ranking a job's importance to the employer, grouping positions, values based upon skills or management responsibilities, using some sort of objective point factor system in order to weigh different kind of jobs and then group them. But the key here is going to be having a methodology and using one, hopefully, that has been tried and true within that particular jurisdiction. I think, one question that we had in here that I saw as I scrolled past was, do we, if there's existing kind of job categories outlined within a collective bargaining agreement, for a particular jurisdiction, would that apply? Yes, as long as those agreements are valid, I would say leaning on something where it's already been established, particularly something where workers have had input on it, is going to be a great starting point for a particular company in an EU jurisdiction. And the caveat there is unless that EU member state has specifically chosen to reject that way of categorizing workers, and or they strongly recommend within their implementation of the EU directive a different categorizing system, I would always weigh in with going with whatever the EU member state is requiring of you. Anything you want to add here, Nasser, before we move on?
Yeah, no, I think that's a good question. I think it was, if you have sort of a framework already that's existent, I would recommend, going off of that and expanding it. I don't imagine, I think the goal of the EU Pay Transparency Directive is going to be harmony between the EU member states. So it could be that the EU member states wind up looking at each other and trying to make sure their job categorizations don't clash too heavily with one another. I'd be very surprised if, for example, like Spain and Germany wind up having two completely different laws on how to categorize workers. I don't imagine that's going to be the case. So I think a good starting point is if you have this sort of evaluation already taking place in a EU member state like Spain, for example, to expand that potentially for other EU member states. And it's probably going to be easier to tweak that in the future if necessary, rather than starting from scratch each time.
So I think we already touched on this, right? When we talked about what equal pay of work of equal value really means, right? It's to address this kind of underrepresentation in higher paid jobs of women and women in lower paid jobs. If anybody wants to talk about that more, they can. I know we want to have some time for questions and we're getting close to closing out. So I'm going to hop through these last slides quickly so that we can get to, looks like we have over 16 questions here. So I don't think we're going to get to all of them, but we will try to get to as many as we possibly can. Do you want to just touch on non-compliance and risks?
These slides. Yeah, it's essentially there are potential sanctions to the EU Pay Transparency Directive. It leaves a lot of the sanctions, the authority on the member states on how they want to implement it. That's probably the part where it's the most variable, more flexible based on the EU member state. As we discussed before, Sweden did implement sanctions proposed in their proposed legislation. And additionally, there's more legal standards for employers to comply with in terms of a pay discrimination suit. As we'll go on to this next slide, for example, there's a shift in the burden of proof in these pay discrimination cases, where traditionally it was on the employee potentially to find the evidence to prove that they're being paid inequitably, but the EU Pay Transparency Directive wanted to shift that onto the employer to prove that no, they're just, the evidence is that they're not, that they are being paid equitably. So that burden of proof shifting is pretty important in the EU Pay Transparency Directive. Obviously, there's sort of risks and penalties involved if an employer is not found to be paying their employees equitably, and it could be that you're going to have to compensate certain groups for being underpaid. There could be injunctive relief in an order to pay certain employees a certain amount or to stop paying employees inequitably. And obviously, there could be penalties associated with that, with associated mitigating factors if they apply. And that is and just to quickly get through these questions.
I'm gonna, the last couple slides here, I'm just gonna flip through quickly. These are just FIQs and some additional resources for people. These are definitions, again, for anybody, just as like a reference point when you download these slides. The applicability determination in the EU, again, this just gives you kind of the resources on where you can understand what is a micro, a small, and a medium-sized company according to the directive, how that headcount, worker headcount is determined. I think we actually had a couple of questions regarding that in the slides here, but here's just some more information on how you determine your number of workers based on the hours worked and the other kind of methodology there. And then here is just a bunch of resources for anybody that wants to do some further reading on the directive and on kind of the guidelines associated with it. And then with that, I'm going to pull up our Q&A here. And start with the first one. Is there a mandate to publish salary bands in job adverts, or can they be provided to candidates who specifically request for this during the hiring process? So to the answer, we sort of answered that already, but the answer there is yes and no, right? According to the directive, it's going to be required to be provided beforehand. The directive does not require it to be in the advertisement itself, right? And correct me if I'm wrong there, Nasser, but like that's the kind of the framework there. It can't just be that you will provide it upon request. You do have to provide it beforehand.
Yeah. And it might just be employers wind up just putting it in this the job posting anyway to comply with other, US-based requirements or something like that. But that'd be an easy way to do it. But if they do not want to do that, then they theoretically could just individually provide it to each applicant.
Yeah, and that does get to a good point. In this presentation, we're kind of emphasizing baseline requirements versus best practices, right? The best practice here really would be just to develop a process of putting it in the advertisement, because then you don't have to worry about, oh, did I remember to send this to this applicant prior to them showing up for their interview? Because as long as it's in the advertisement, you're covered. Second question here, how are non-binary gender employees handled in the gender pay gap analysis, or those who have not declared their gender, for instance? We're going to wait for additional guidance on this with individual EU member states as they implement this, because this question is left very opaque in the directive itself. It doesn't address directly how you're supposed to handle identifying gender for your individual employees in the context of doing this analysis.
Right. And even I think, I'll review it again, but even Sweden's proposed legislation didn't have clear guidance on dealing with non-binary or have not declared their gender. I imagine EU member states with a very proactive stance or more firm stance on dealing with non-binary genders will have more specific guidance on how to report those categories of employees in their specific legislation when they adopt the EU Pay Transparency Directive.
What I would say too is if there are other laws within that EU member state, and I mean that just piggybacks on what you're saying, Nasser, that treat non-binary or those who have not declared a gender a particular way in context of other genders, right? Then that same framework would probably apply here, right? As far as a EU member state being consistent across the board. Are the headcount thresholds for reporting at a legal entity level or a parent company level? That's going to be at the entity level for each entity, with the caveat that if there's a parent company that has several entities underneath it, they will likely force you to aggregate. This gets to the idea of different EU member states. And also, please understand that we kind of simplified this. There are other, in the EU Pay Transparency Directive, there are particular rules regarding, for example, US-based companies that might have a EU presence through a subsidiary company, and when those reporting thresholds get triggered for them. So there's a lot of detail on this in our FAQs and other resources that we've provided. I would recommend reading through it. For a lot of companies that have different employee counts in different jurisdictions with a very complex parent-subsidiary relationship, you're likely going to trigger multiple reporting requirements across those jurisdictions. Then number 4, should the analysis be segregated, split by country, or also carried out at a global level? From a best practices perspective, all and above, right? I think the best practice for large multinationals is to do large-scale analysis across their global footprint. When it comes to your actual reporting requirements, though, there are going to be different requirements for each individual member state. And/or if you're a multinational that, for example, operates out of the state of Illinois in the United States, but then also has an EU presence, you're going to potentially trigger reporting requirements in the United States as well as outside of the United States. You will need to do separate segregated analyses for each one of those requirements.